we'll get to that. So let's begin. The question today is who is a Jew? What are the Jewish people? So it seems like a simple question, but it is absolutely not. First of all, two interesting facts. I like trivial information. It is estimated by historians that if you were a Jew living in the year 1700, there were only 1 million Jews in the entire world. To give you some idea. Of course, the population of the world was much smaller then. That's in comparison to about 6 million Jews who lived at the time of the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70 CE. The Jewish population was quite small, and that as a result of migrations, bubonic plagues, Jews unable to find any place of settlement to have families and grow in the year 1700, which was not a great time to be a Jew. There were only 1 million in the whole world. It is also estimated by demographers who spend time looking at these things that if there had not been a Shoah, Holocaust, there would have been estimated between 35 and 40 million Jews today. To give you some idea, that would have made our people quite a strong numerical force in the world and would have made a huge difference in the way that Jewish life develops. It's quite fascinating. So we can speculate about all that. That's part of the Jewish story as well. But what is the reality today? Would anybody like to fathom a guess as to how many Jews there are in the world, worldwide? 14 to 14 and a half million. Thank you. Should have known that Sawyer would come up with that. About 14 and a half million people, perhaps close to 15 million. It's hard to tell. It's very interesting when I've asked my students at the university who are not Jewish that question, they usually say about 50 million. They think the Jews are running the whole show here, and that's part of the stereotype, which is just simply incorrect. Jews constitute 0.002% of the world's population. This is called a little sliver in the entire world perspective. So 14.5 to 15 million people. Hasn't changed much in the years because our population growth is actually going down outside of Israel. In Israel, the Jewish population is going up. There are how many Jews living in Israel now? It's a rapidly growing population. Almost, well, 9 million in the country, but about 7 million Jews living there. And of course, it's very hard to really reach a number of Jews living outside of Israel because of assimilation, of acculturation, of Jews who are not identifying with Jews anymore. It's much easier in Israel to define those things. So that's an interesting fact that, of course, that we should worry about all the time. The declining Jewish population in the diaspora, the increased population in Israel. I don't remember how many years ago, but the Jewish population in Israel bypassed the largest Jewish population in the world in the United States. I would guess about 5-6 years ago. That's it. Our population is shrinking here. Their population is growing. And that, of course, has tremendous ramifications looking forward to the future. Just to give you an idea of how startling it is, in 1948, when Israel was fighting for its right to exist as a nation, the total Jewish population was, anybody know what the figure was? The total Jewish population in 1948 in Israel, in the newly declared state of Israel, 660,000. That's it. And 3% of that population was killed during the war, which way too many. At that time, the Jews living in Israel were almost completely dependent upon Jews living outside of Israel. The pendulum is rapidly changing, and many have said that it's not too far along into the future, where we American Jews are going to be relying more and more and more on the center of Jewish life in Israel, because everything is completely changed. It used to be, I've been involved with Israel bonds for a long time. I'm a great believer in investment in Israel. But if you go back to the beginnings of Israel bonds, which just celebrated its 70th year, so you know that Israel bonds began in 1951. Bonds used to provide, like, I don't remember what the figure was, like 7 to 10% of the total budget of the state of Israel. That figure now, even though the money is significant, we're talking about less than 0.5% of Israel's total budget provided by investment from Jews outside of Israel. Israel's a big place now with a multi-billion-dollar economy, and while bonds gives it a little bit of edge, and I believe it's important, Israel's no longer dependent as it used to be. So the demographics are quite interesting. How many Jews live in the United States? I think I just mentioned about 5.5 million. When I was born in 1953, it was estimated that there were about 6.5 million Jews, and that we were a population of 3% of the United States. That figure is shrinking as the population of the United States now reaching about 335 million people. As the numbers of Jews decreases, this has a lot of implications in terms of our political clout and voting. Even though Jews give and are more involved than any other segment of the population in the United States, nevertheless, numbers do speak. And it's something that Jewish leadership, everybody, should be aware of, as our influence by numbers decreases with regard to the rest of the population. So it's I'm just throwing out different things for your thoughts on the subject. Where are the largest populations of Jews outside of Israel and the United States? Does anybody know which country would come in third? France. Elaine. Will Elaine and Sawyer please leave here? You're answering all the questions. Even though the French Jewish population is now shrinking for a variety of reasons, Jews are leaving France because of huge amount of anti-Semitism there, and they're coming to London. I can witness that because in our neighborhood, we saw French Jews everywhere. They're leaving, of course, for Israel, Neve Tzedek, and Tel Aviv. It's all French Jews now. By the way, you can get some really good pastry there. So if you're ever in Tel Aviv, it's French Jews, and many coming elsewhere, the United States as well. There are about 660,000 Jews left in France. That is the largest diaspora population outside of Israel. And of course, half of French Jewry come from North American countries, Morocco, Tunisia, where? Quebec? I can't hear with your mask on. North African, what did I say, North American? North African countries, Morocco, Algeria, that whole swing there. And then half the population of France are Ashkenazic Jews. But that population is also shrinking. And then what would be third, you think? It's interesting still. Actually, if you combine these two countries, they have more than France. And those are the Jews who are left in the former Soviet Union. It's estimated there are about 1 million Jews left in all the 13 Soviet republics of the former Soviet Union. But they're all broken up now. Ukraine's a separate country from Russia. So that's why France is number 2. But if you want to look at the picture of the former Soviet Union, that was a population that had about 3 million Jews, or 2.5 million Jews, and that shrunk dramatically. I was part of that movement to get the Jews out of the Soviet Union, where they went to Israel and they went to the United States. About 1.2 million Jews went to Israel. 1.1 million Jews came to the United States, Canada, and other countries as well. In the United Kingdom has a significant Jewish population, estimated between 250 and 290,000 Jews living there. It is, it's not working?
Yeah, it's working. But
I'm not close enough. All right. Can you hear me? You can still hear? Good. Because I can't see you. I can't see you, people. So I turn around. Okay. The population on Argentina is estimated as about the same, 250 to 290,000. And those are the large Jewish pockets. I don't know what the current population in Canada might be, but it pales in significance to these other countries. So those are some of the demographics. So but the interesting question is, how do we define who is a Jew? This has been an issue for all of our people's existence, and there have been different views on that subject. And the three basic categories, and you might hear different answers from different people. The ones who come to synagogue, who don't come to synagogue, would say, I'm a Jew by ethnicity. I'm a cultural Jew. You might hear Jews who are living in Israel say, I am a nationalist. I'm an Israeli Jew. I'm an Israeli first before I'm a Jew. The more assimilated they are in Israel, the more likely they are to use that as a criterion for their definition. My wife, coming from the former Soviet Union, would also use that definition. She, in her passport, was labeled Yevri. A Jew was a part of a national group. Religion, because it was completely prohibited in the Soviet Union, except if you were over the age of 85 or 90, young people had no options to know anything about our religion. They saw themselves as being branded as a separate ethnic national group. And then you have the opposite. You might have someone from certain Hasidic circles. Most Hasidic circles would say, listen, we are part of a religious group. We're not a nation. That's why there still is a large component of Hasidic Jews who denounce and reject Zionism for its national implications as a nation. No, we're a religious group. Hasidism grew out of the shtetls in Eastern Europe. The reality of that culture, which we're going to get to, we're going to study all these things between both classes. The reality is that they always define themselves as a religious group waiting for Hashem to return them to the Holy Land, detached from any secular political agenda. So as I've just shared with you, we have Jews all over the world, including here in the United States, who identify themselves in all kinds of different ways. I would guess that most Jews who are members of Temple Bet Shalom would probably use a combination of all the things that I've mentioned, that we're certainly part of a nation, maybe nation's too strong, but certainly a people that has a religion as its core. So the question is, what is the truth? Are we a nation / people? Are we a religious group? Are we here's the third one, which is really interesting, a racial group? Are we defined by our blood stream? So let me take each of those separately. By the way, if you have any questions along the way, I can't see you behind me, but if someone can see what's behind, I can address a question. That's fine. Actually, I can see the screen from afar here, so that I should get my eyes focused there. So let's take, first of all, the nation peoplehood thing. Is that a legitimate definition of who we are? Are we a nation and people? Forget the religion right now. Well, the answer is yes. And it's not just because of Zionism. It's always been the case through all the years of Jewish history, from the time of our national existence in the land of Israel, between approximately the year 1250 BCE until 70 C. By the way, the New York Times discounted all those years of Jewish history, saying that we were only a nation during the Hasmonean period between 60 BCE and 70 CE, and they were called on the carpet for that, completely dismissing the whole biblical period. But certainly during the biblical period, we were always defined as a nation, the people of Israel, the nation of Israel, Am Yisrael. And what happened after the expulsion of the Jews from the land of Israel by the Romans, and Jews left? It was a very extremely rare occasion for Jews ever to feel a part of any other national existence until the late 18th century, when glimmerings started to begin. In the 19th century, there were no Jews who could ever say, I am a part of the nation of Spain. I am part of the nation of Germany. It was not allowed. Jews were always considered to be a separate nation. And as a matter of fact, Jews always defined themselves as a separate people. We didn't want to be part of Christendom or the Islamic world or any other place that we lived in, even when things were better in certain periods in medieval Spain. Never. Jewish life always defined itself with different language, different boundaries, different calendar, different laws, different court system. Almost throughout the period of our dispersion, Jews always maintained separate court systems, separate schools, separate residences. That is, when we try to understand why Zionism developed in the late 19th century, and all of a sudden there were Jews that said, hey, wait, we're a people, we're a nation. It didn't just come out of the blue. It's the way Jews basically lived, even when there was no state of Israel. Nationalism, peoplehood was always part of our definition. Now, there were, especially in 18th, 19th century Eastern Europe, the pendulum swung more towards defining ourselves as a religious group only. We'll get into that mentality. But the fact is that over the course of Jewish history, Jewish law, Jewish life, Jewish history always defined itself as a separate and unique, not just religion, but a people. And the rabbis, by the way, in our medieval codes we think we're the only Jews who have dealt with the fact that there are Jews who have wanted to assimilate or get rid of their Jewishness. The rabbis debated for centuries what to do with a Jew who decided to convert to Christianity or Islam. Were they still a Jew or not? And the general weight of the decision-making process was that once you are defined as part of the people of Israel, the Jewish people, you are always a Jew, no matter what you do. I have a little different way of looking at that. But anyway, that was debated through all the centuries. We know that there are Jews forever who have not been religious, but they would always count themselves as being a Jew. We wouldn't dismiss, for example, the years of Jewry after the Bolshevik Revolution, 1917, even though they didn't go to synagogue. They weren't allowed to go to synagogue, but they were Jews. They were Jews by definition because they were born. So it's so interesting. And in our modern history, and I think we're dealing with this today, but you hear often, I like Jews. I'm not an anti-Semite. I want Israel destroyed. Can you really do that? That was an 18th century when I forgot his name in the French Assembly of Deputies declared To Jews as individuals, everything. To Jews as a people, a separate nation, nothing. It's part of the value system of the late 18th century. Became very pronounced during the 19th century with anti-Semitism and nationalism. And then, of course, the greatest poison we've had to deal with, the emergence of Marxist-Leninism, the pain that our people faced by being stripped of their peoplehood, their nationality. And that we're living with today, because we're going to get to all these subjects, how Islam sees us and Christians see us. It's very complicated, but we have to know who we are first. So when anybody tells you that we're not a nation, you have no right to sovereignty, it's bunk, historical and religious falsehood, period. And that's why it's so dangerous to the rise of anti-Semites who are trying to strip Jews of their national history, especially the attachment to Eretz Yisrael. And by the way, if you have any feelings different, just object. Now, okay, so nationality. The second issue is religion. Are we a religious group? And the question obviously is, we're here at the synagogue, so we've answered that question already. We've built synagogues. The synagogue was the first religious institution ever in the history of humanity that was built outside, a religious institution outside the central cult of a particular nation. Our religion was everywhere. That's how the synagogue developed. We're going to get to that when we speak of the history of synagogues. So even Mordechai Kaplan, who was not a great nationalist and very left, liberal, progressive in his view of Judaism, he labeled in his book, Judaism as a Civilization, I believe 1929, when he wrote that classic book, still a great read. He labeled being a Jew being part of a religious civilization. I would amend the word civilization. I understand he was trying to say, he was trying to water down the word peoplehood. I think better would have just been religious nation or religious peoplehood, which is unique. We'll get to the Islamic model, which is close, but not as equal, as the same as the Jewish model. Now, there were movements in the 19th century, especially when Jews were very interested in assimilating and becoming accepted. Enlightenment ideas, or socialists, especially with socialism, became very popular with many Jews who attempted to strip the Jewish people of our religion, the complete opposite of the Hasidic model. Socialists believed in a time when there would be no religion. It's like a John Lennon song, Imagine. Imagine there's no country. Imagine there's no religion. That was very popular in the 19th century with Marx and a lot of the Jewish Bundists who wanted to maintain Jewish ethnicity, peoplehood, but without the religion. They saw religion as an impediment to becoming a nation, to becoming part of the world. And there were many extreme Zionists, such as Ber Borchov, who was a Marxist Zionist, who wanted the new Jewish state to be stripped completely of Judaism. Now, that's pretty hard we'll try to understand it as we get into the historical unit, but it's pretty hard to make a case for a definition of being a Jew without the religious component, and to realize that those extremists in contemporary Jewish history are really unique, because throughout all the biblical period, throughout the rabbinic period, throughout the medieval period, there was never a definition of being a Jew without Judaism. Never. So it's a small period of time. I think it's a very influential period of time. I think there are a lot of Jews who define themselves, I will never step foot in a synagogue, but I feel I'm a Jew. So this issue is still up in the air. But if we were going to come up with a way of describing ourselves to the rest of the world, it'd be pretty hard to find a definition of a Jew without nationhood and without religion. Okay, you got me so far? And certainly the Soviet Union tried to define Jews as entirely an archaic religious fossil group. And also in Christianity and Islam, both those religions completely rejecting Jewish nationalism, only saw Jews as being part of a religious group. Now think of the implications that has for today. There's still many in the Christian world who have a hard time with Jewish sovereignty. Very difficult time. Because we're going to get into that. The theology of Christianity was to subject the Jews to non-sovereignty, non-nationality, and a period of subjection. They're still dealing with that. And the same with Islam. In Islam, Jews were supposed to be subservient to Islamic authority and never allowed to have any Jewish national say. It's also part of the political equation today. Very important. To understand all these components is really important, is very vital in understanding who we are today. So I'm planting seeds right now that we're going to develop along the way. Now, the interesting one is race. Is there such a thing as Jewish blood? And then the answer to that, and I'm talking about the sweep of Judaism and Jewish history. The answer to that is 100% and more wrong. There is no such thing, no description in any legal code, in any religious text of Jews being a bloodline. Never. In fact, I mentioned it this Shabbat, that the reason why our Torah begins with Adam and Eve, Adam and Chava, is in order to show us that we are part of the nations of the world. And from all of our prophets, reading the book of Ruth, who comes from Moabite background, we know that people who became part of the Jewish people came from all kinds of racial and ethnic backgrounds. There is no such thing as Jewish blood. When I hear that, I go crazy. Where did that idea of Jewish blood come from? It is a late invention. Well, not really. When did it start? With the beginning of it's a good trivia question, by the way. The beginning of the Spanish Inquisition in 1391. The Catholic Church had a very big problem. It was forcibly converting Jews to Christianity against their will. And there were what they labeled conversos, or the ones who really hated those people were called marranos, or swine. And the church began an inquisition to weed out those new Christians who were still practicing Judaism. Not every new Christian was doing that, but a large part of those people were practicing Judaism in their basements, in their closets, at home, behind closed doors, and they were artificially going through. Can you imagine if we were in a situation like that, where we were forced to convert to Christianity, but we wanted our families to maintain their Jewish existence? That's what a lot of people were doing. It's a very interesting part of our history. But in 1391, the church was so interested, they came up with a new definition of a Jew. Forget the fact that they converted to Christianity. They are tainted by their blood. It's called, I forgot, the limpia sangre, the purity of blood. So they began defining Christians and Jews in terms of blood, that a real Christian is one who's born of Christian lineage. This was a sickness, but we can understand why it happened. They had a big problem. It's, for example, if we go to Spain and Portugal next year, which I hope we will, in 1497, in Portugal, I don't know if you know, I'm taking, by the way, I love these little tangents. In 1492, when the Jews were expelled from Spain, those are those Jews who refused to convert to Christianity, they left the country. They just left en masse. But a lot of them went to Portugal because right around the block. And Portugal had a very good king, King Juan. I forgot his name, Wyo, whatever. And he welcomed the Jews. He said, "Hey, this is beneficial to my country. I'm getting all this Jewish brain power and know-how, and they're going to help Portugal. Hey, good riddance to Spain." But the problem is Portugal wanted to have a monarchical alliance with Spain. They married in those days for political purposes. Marry the princess because she'll help my political alliance. And that's what this king did. He wanted to have this alliance with Spain. He married the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. And he couldn't make the marriage because the Spanish royal family said, you have to get rid of your Jews in order for this marriage to happen. So the king of Portugal was in a very difficult position. He wanted the Jews there, but he also wanted the marriage. So he was kind of stuck. So what did he decide to do? He came up with a brilliant plan. I'm going to demand by force all the Jews to come to the main plaza in Lisbon. We'll go there. We'll see it. Gathered whatever thousands of Jews were there on one day in 1497. And he called the head cardinal or whatever it was in Lisbon. And he said, I want you to declare, sprinkle your holy water and declare that all the Jews are now Christians. That way, those people can stay in Portugal and they fulfilled my obligation to the royal family in Spain. Can you imagine showing up someplace, they're sprinkling water and say, okay, now you're not Jewish. That's what they did. Another side, I just finished this book about the kidnapping of Edgardo Montara, a great, unbelievable book by David Kurtzer. You should read it. It reads like a suspense novel about the 6-year-old Jewish kid in Bologna, Italy, where there were 200 Jewish families. This was in 1858. You know what happened? The 6-year-old kid of this Jewish family, the Montara family, whatever their last name is, in Bologna, kind of a upper middle class Jewish family that ran a business. They had 7 other kids, and they had a housekeeper, a 14-year-old Italian peasant in their home. And when this child was 1 year old, the housekeeper sprinkled water on the child because the church was trying to encourage Jews to be converted. And so, it's hard for us to understand. You sprinkle this water and all of a sudden the kid is a Christian. So anyway, and this peasant girl, she was a nothing. She stole things. The family got rid of her. She said, I'm going to get back at the family. And she went to the local authorities. They had, by the way, the Inquisition in Italy. It wasn't removed until the nationalism in Italy in like 1870 or so. So she went to the local inquisitor there with the church and the cardinal and said, listen, I know that there's an instruction from the church that we should baptize Jewish kids. I did that when this child was 1 year old, and the Pope Pius IX ordered his Inquisition police to come. The church was in charge of the military and everything then. I've learned a lot about the history of Italy. And they went and they kidnapped the child, declaring that the child was no longer Jewish and not allowed to be raised in this defiled, miserable, decadent Jewish family. This is 1858. So they kidnapped this child under the same principle that existed in the late 14th century, that once you baptize a child, all of a sudden that makes them Christian. And what developed is those cases in which, I won't tell you what happened with this kid, because the parents did everything to get the kid back. It's quite a story. Read about it. The church had this problem. What do you do in a case where you baptize, you sprinkle water, and the child doesn't want to be a Christian anymore? So then you come up with this blood issue. Well, this blood issue existed in the church for centuries, and then became very popular in the 19th century when race, anthropology was the fad of the world. And with the rise of nationalism came the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe, and the anti-Semitism of the modern period became race. Everything, Jews were defined as a racial group, not by us, but by the outside world. And it, of course, led to all of our problems, and we got smacked pretty good with the racial theories by the time of Adolf Hitler and Nazism in the 1930s. Some scholars believe that the racial factor of anti-Semitism disappeared because Hitler was such an extreme response. But I would bet you that if you ask a lot of people who are not Jewish, they would still define Jews in terms of some kind of a bloodline. I don't want to experiment, but I would bet you that the definition still lingers, which is insidious and horrendous to the 15% of Jewry in the United States who converted to Judaism from all kinds of backgrounds. Black, brown, yellow, African, you name it. This is the best part of being Jewish, that we're a people from all over the world. It's estimated that at the time of the Roman occupation in Judea and Samaria in the first century, that 10% of the Jewish population were converts to Judaism. Larry, you wanted to? Ah, that's right. I would, it's very Larry's question. Let me repeat because they're not able to hear. What is this? Oh, a little note. Born of, oh, yeah, we're going to get to how we define ourselves. Ted, hold on to your question. We're going to get ourselves to that, how we define ourselves. But Larry's question is a very interesting one because we've done DNA testing, and it's really incredible. They have found that there's a genetic DNA formula for Kohanim, for priests and Levites. Some special, you imagine through all the generations that bloodline, by that way, that's the only bloodline that really continued in Judaism. That's through the definition of the Kohen and the Levi. But we'll get to all those things. My explanation for that is beginning in the first century, with the advent of Christianity and then Islam, when it became almost impossible for Jews to ever assimilate, Jews had to stay separate and wanted to stay separate. And because conversion was liable to death penalty for the one who converted, and entire Jewish villages were burned to the ground for even attempting to convert someone not Jewish to Judaism. So for most of the centuries of Jewish life, the option of converting from someone who was not Jewish was almost impossible. So I'm not a geneticist, but I would guess that the reason why we've maintained this kind of DNA is only because of historical circumstance, but has nothing to do with Jewish law and Jewish ethics. So it's an interesting issue, but I think there are other explanations to it. We live in different times now, especially after World War II, in which the fluidity of religious religious definition has become more the norm and closer to the model of the Roman Empire, when people were converting in huge numbers to Judaism. When Jews are freer and more accepted, there's more conversion. When Jews are blocked out and not able to live with non-Jews, then you have very little blood mingling. But that doesn't mean that it was ever the idea of someone becoming Jewish was ever rejected. For example, in my ancestor, I forgot which one I have. I did this DNA testing, and it was like 99.1% Jewish ancestry. I always, where did the 0.9%? There was something about Sardinian background in my DNA. Where did that come from? So there was some kind of non-Jewish ancestor a few hundred years ago. I don't know. And we all have that, but it wasn't the norm because people weren't allowed to convert to Judaism. It was simply out of the question. And it's very important to understand that. So the question is, how do we really define ourselves? Nation, religion, not a race. And we can prove it by Jewish codes, code of Jewish law. How do you become Jewish? One, you have, as I was lucky by fate, having a beautiful Jewish mother. That's Jewish law, through the mother. We can talk about the patriarchal descent and all that, which the Reform movement has tried to define this differently. It is true that during the biblical period, the definition of a Jew is by the father, but rabbinic law, we're rabbinic Jews. The definition was through the mother. There are reasons for that in terms of definition of identity, which became a reality to the rabbis in the, even before the first century. But by Jewish law, you are defined as a Jew by either one, being born of a Jewish mother, which is a biological definition, or two, becoming Jewish, a Jew by choice. Those are the two avenues. Now, this almost proves how much of a nation we are, because whether you live in the United States or the United Kingdom or Germany, every country, every nation has to define its national boundaries. We have a big issue in the United States about who's coming in here and who's becoming a citizen, who's not a citizen. Is there a legal way of doing it or not a legal way? We're not going to get into that political mess. But Jews through the centuries always had to define who's in and who's out. And the definition was Jewish mother or conversion to Judaism. The path of becoming Jewish, even in the most extreme Hasidic communities, they might try to prevent it because they come from a shtetl mentality of the 18th century. You would be shocked to hear some of the ways in which Orthodox rabbis keep people who are not Jewish from becoming Jewish, which I think is terribly, terribly wrong. Because they could never deny that in Jewish law, whether it be Maimonides or Joseph Caro in the Shulchan Aruch, and through the Talmud and all the legal codes of Judaism, the path of becoming Jewish was always normative Jewish law. There was a minority view of a rabbi who felt that we shouldn't be accepting converts at all because we never can trust them. But that was a minority view. It was never the majority opinion. I had this out once. We had a debate in my federation back a long time ago with the Orthodox rabbi in town. And I simply opened up the Shulchan Aruch. I said, read what it says about, because you're not accepting people who want to become Jewish. But read your codes. You study the same Jewish law as I do. And the fact is that the codes are very welcoming and embracing. In fact, Maimonides in the 12th century said that the reason why Jews are dispersed is to bring non-Jews into Judaism. And he would say, we've done that to some degree with Christianity and Islam. Judaism influenced those two religions, but we especially welcome those people who have tied their fate with our mitzvot and the Jewish people. So we've always defined ourselves in that way, which is an unusual combination of, again, nation and religion. And by the way that you become part of the people is through the religious path. That's not the path of becoming a national, let's say in the United States. But if you look at the laws of the laws, I'm not talking about what's going on now, but the laws of the United States, there are two ways of being an American citizen. I'm an American citizen, and I'm sure you are as well. because my parents happen to be American citizens. I was born, I still think Los Angeles, California is part of the United States, as far as I've read this morning. So I'm a U.S. citizen from by birth. It was a biological fact. But we have I don't know what the numbers are in the United States, but I would guess they're large and growing, of people who became American citizens by naturalization. It's like American conversion. You become an American citizen, you wait 5 years, you have a green card or whatever, and that's the legal way by which people become American citizens. And our country, and I'm proud of it, like other countries, have accepted people who were not born in this country, but who immigrated to this country. My grandparents were naturalized American citizens. They were born in the shtetls in Ukraine, but that doesn't mean they were any less American when they became American citizens. It's the same as being Jewish. The reason why I bring that up is because when people ask you who is a Jew, this is the way that we respond to that. Not a racial group. The biology is stemmed to our existence as a people, as a nation. Because there's another, the proof that we're not a racial group is that we've embraced Jews from Uganda, Ethiopia, India, China, from all over. You go to Israel and you see newspapers in every language in the world. I marvel when I go to Israel and see the Ethiopians in the military, and as they're more assimilating into Israeli society, a lot of the tensions of the past have gone away, and they've really become part of the Israeli populace. And it's a beautiful thing. That's the Jewish people. We're not bound by any particular group. Now, the Zionists and Dubnov, I mentioned a note here, they tried to define ourselves entirely as a national group. I mentioned that before, as opposed, what was going on in the 19th century is you had the two major religious movements in Germany, some degree in France, certainly in England, were Orthodox and Reform. Conservative movement developed much, much later. And both the Orthodox and Reform movements define Jews increasingly as just a religious group. The Reform, we're saying, were Hebrews of the Mosaic faith in Germany. And the Orthodox, especially in Eastern Europe, were defining themselves like the Hasids as traditionally bound Jews, as opposed to the Jewish nationalists and whatnot. So we're still formulating who we are, but this is where I think the conservative movement has shined, because from the onset of conservative Judaism, again, we'll get to all this, has been the pillars that we are part of a people and part of a religion, both. And you need both components to understand the historical truth of how we define ourselves as a Jew. When you stray to extremes on both sides, you lose the core of who we are as a people and as a religion. You need both. So Neturei Karta, that rejects the state of Israel, they're really remnants of an old position. The same with the diehard communists, Marxists, socialists in Israel and elsewhere, who try to deny Jewish religious nature of who we are. Those elements are in many ways very, very dangerous. Now, the question is, any questions yet before, because I want to discuss now how this model of being Jewish differs from the Christian and Islamic models, because those are the two other monotheistic religions. And since they both of them, which we will show, emerged from Judaism. By the way, I read interesting books. I'm reading a book now entitled "Did Muhammad Exist?" And the premise of the book is everybody's afraid to ask that question. But the fact is we have very, very little historical information about Muhammad, which doesn't appear until the Hadith 150 and 200 years after he supposedly died. There are only, I mentioned this to you, Larry, there are only, how many references to Muhammad are there in the entire Quran? 4. How many references to Moses in the Quran? 158. And 69 of Abraham. 4 of Muhammad. And 3 of the 4 don't really speak of Muhammad as a person. You have to read the book. He dissects all this information. And, he also said, the author, that we've done this with Jesus many hundreds of years now. There's nothing anti-Islamic about raising this question about the historicity of where Islam comes from. And one of the scholars, I forgot the name, who has dealt with this question from years ago, believes that Islam developed entirely from one of the Jewish, I shouldn't say sect, or tribes that existed in the area, and that it developed out of that Jewish component. It's very interesting. But we will get into that and how Islam shares much of its Jewish roots. So how all that happened, the pieces we'll try to put together. It's fascinating stuff, which I always say all these issues complicates the relationship of, for example, Muslims and Jews today. It's a very unusual relationship, but we'll get to that. So the question is, how does the Jewish definition differ from the Christian and Islamic definition of Christians and Muslims? Let's first take the Christian model. Is there an ethnic Christian? The answer to that is yes, to some degree, especially when you get into Christian communities, for example, in the Middle East and the Arab world. Christians have more of a tendency to define themselves not just as a religion, but part of a distinct ethnic minority. It's complicated. And that developed out of the embrace of Islam, which tended to look upon Jews, all the religious minorities, Jews and Christians, as not just religious components, but religious groups that had certain responsibilities as a group of people. But generally, it would be pretty hard for a Christian to say, I'm part of the Christian nation or the Christian people. Because at the heart of Christianity, the idea was that individuals all over the world would search for individual salvation, which crossed all national lines. For example, what Christianity did to Jerusalem and to the Jewish roots, they tried to excise all that, the national peoplehood seeds of their existence, and to say, we don't need any earthly definitions anymore. There's heavenly Jerusalem, but no such thing as earthly Jerusalem. That's why Christianity, except for a few years during the Crusades, had any claim upon the land of Israel or in Jerusalem. They basically, because the purpose of Christianity was religious salvation on an individual level. There's no such thing as a Christian nation. And that is why when nationalism developed in the 17th century, 18th century, with all these different royal houses and whatnot, they fought each other pretty good because they defined themselves as Germans and French and all the Italians and all the different components. Now the church, the Vatican, was trying to consolidate all these nationalities into the rule of the church, and it ultimately failed because what happened in Christianity, as existed in the Middle Ages as well, even then, that the church always had a difficult time holding on to all these different national components. They weren't Jewish. There wasn't a sense, which is hard for us. One of the beauties of being Jewish is I can go to Brazil, I can go to Moscow, I can go to California, I think still. I can go all over the world. I walk into a synagogue or all the barriers kind of fall by the wayside. Now, Christians can go to other churches in different countries, but it's not the same feeling of family and peoplehood. And that's because it's rooted in their, again, this is not better or worse, it's just a fact. It's rooted in their religious component of individual salvation as being the model, and no such notion of Christendom as a nation. So you would define a Christian as one who is part of a religious group, whether it be Catholic or Protestant or Unitarian. Still, nevertheless, the definition is entirely religious. You can be a Belgian Christian, an Italian Christian, a Nigerian Christian, but your definition is entirely religious. If you say, you really can't say I'm a Christian, but I disavow Christianity, doesn't work. You can do that as a Jew, because as I mentioned, our definition is of a peoplehood. You don't have to be a religious Jew to define yourself as a Jew. Whether we like that or not, whether that's going to last long, nevertheless, that's how we're very different than Christians, than the Christian model. You can be a Jew, it's not religious. I don't think you can be a Christian without having, and I disavow Christianity. I'm not a Christian. That's it. Goes out the window. So there's certainly no such thing as a Christian race, although that became somewhat interesting, popular in the 19th century. As I mentioned, the seeds were planted by the Catholic Church. The idea of, it wasn't a religious racial definition, but there was a sense of a Christian civilization. And you know what Hitler did with all those racial theories. Now, how about Islam? How do you define yourself in Islam? It's closer to the Jewish model because, by the way, the name for nation in Islam is Ummah, and in Hebrew it's So you can see the similarity. You're part of a nation of Islam. Nationalism has played a bigger role in the development of Islam. Islam was based entirely upon political organization, who the caliph was, who was in charge of the power. So there was a political component, which is much greater than the Jewish idea of peoplehood, because Jewish peoplehood developed without national sovereignty. So it was peoplehood without nationality. Whereas in Islam, it is impossible. That's why it's very difficult for Muslims living as a minority in non-Muslim countries. And they're struggling with it. We know that there's huge issue, not so much in the United States, but in France, in the UK, with whose law must they adhere to? Sharia law or English law, French law? I don't hear that coming up in the United States so much. But it's a struggle that Muslims have had because their historical definition has been almost entirely from a political, national umbrella. That's why many have said Islamic extremism is very dangerous to the West, because the goal is they cannot live as a minority. They must rule the minorities. They must become a political power. What do you think ISIS and Al-Qaeda, what they were trying to do? If you don't understand the religious roots of everything that's been going on in our last half century, you really missed the boat. And it comes from large elements in the Islamic world that attempt to define themselves entirely as a national political power, which was never, ever part of a Jewish agenda. The only similarity is they have more of a definition. However, which Muslims have a hard time understanding, because I have my conversations with certain imams. They cannot understand how a Jew could say, I'm a Jew, but I'm not, I don't care about Judaism at all. Because you can't do that in Islam, which is closer to the Christian model. You can't be a Muslim without the religion, period. That's why every single Muslim country has Islam as the national religion. Even in the most liberal of Islamic countries like Indonesia or Azerbaijan, again, where my wife is from, still the national religion is Islam. All the nations that surround Israel, the national religion is Islam. And that's why they're struggling with Muslims living in Israel, because they're in Israel, there is never going to be a national religion of Islam. It's a Jewish state, which is all very complicated. But Muslims struggle with this issue. You cannot be a Muslim without being religious, and you cannot be a Muslim without being part of the nation. So in other words, the parameters of definition are much stronger than the Jewish definitions of religion and nationality. So you see what we've done here, put on the evidence on the table, is that being Jewish is completely different, totally unique, has elements of both the Christian and Muslim world, but especially in the extreme elements, we don't fit any definition. This boy, what Lenin struggled with and how Jews objected to his definition of the Jews being a religious relic. Yeah, he wrote at length about the Jewish question and really struggled with this issue of Jews being a nationality. And then the Christians struggle with the fact that the Jews are also a nation. And then, of course, we have Jews who struggle with the fact that we have a religion. So I've completely muddled the situation here. But you see, we haven't really come up with a formula yet. We're still, Israel's still a nascent community, and we in the diaspora are trying to struggle with also of who we are. But I think I've shared with you some of the very great distinctions that make us unique and important to the world, because it is, I think, one of the, if I go a complete tangent here, America is a very interesting model, because America, I would propose, and I'm not alone here, if you read Michael Orn's book about America's attachment to its Jewish roots, America started in the 18th century with a very, very strong religious component. It was religion and nationality. It was religion that did not attempt to make everybody the same religion in ideal form, but the whole basis of the United States, the biblical foundations, one nation under God, e pluribus unum, in God we trust. You cannot detach God, not a particular religion, but a Judeo-Christian component from the history of the United States. I would contend that that is very close to the Jewish model, in which religion and peoplehood were this nice blend, unlike the extremes of, the importance of nationality. Defining oneself as a nation under law is exactly what the Jewish model was. And I would contend that in America, one of our great struggles that we have to wake up to is when we attempt to destroy the religious foundations of this country, which would have been very favorable to Jews, because there's no national religion. We can be who we want. We can choose the religion that we want to practice. But nevertheless, we live in a country that values religious institutions and values. And today, folks, I'm sure you would have your own stories to tell. There's are very growing elements. They're attempting to destroy the foundations of this country. And when you do that, I think you destroy the magic, the miracle of Jewish existence that has been able to maintain a religious definition of itself, but also a national definition with its holidays, its components of peoplehood, its ethnicity, its cultures, its languages. That has been the strength of our existence. And I don't know if the United States will make it long if it becomes just a nation without its foundational values. That's just my view. I could be wrong, but I think there's something very important in the way we Jews have defined ourselves for the rest of the world. The Islamic model is very dangerous. This idea that one religion supersedes all religions and all other religious groups have to be subservient to the dominant religion. We're still living with that. You think it's going away so fast? No. The other model in Christianity, which is the attempt to try to make us all the same religion in its worst times, but also eliminated the idea of national. I'll share you my example of the weaknesses of the Christian definition. As many of you know, I was very involved in the Soviet Jewry issue years ago, and that was really one of the exciting times in my life. I made numerous trips to the former Soviet Union. And I'll never forget, I was in the living room of Lev Elbert. You probably never heard of that name. He lived in Kiev. Big fella. He was in a Soviet prison for about 10 years. And they beat him to a pulp every day. This guy was such a strong, they tried to get him to confess sins that he didn't commit, to renounce the Jewish national movement. They finally let him go because we put enormous pressure through our great leaders here in the United States upon Soviet leaders. Within the Gorbachev year, we were able to get certain prisoners out of prison, and he was freed. He had a bad arm, his leg was busted, and they just completely destroyed this guy. And he said to me, I'll never forget, we were in his living room with his lovely wife, I forgot her name, and he said, Stuart, when you go back to the United States, tell your Christian ministers, he said, I'm lucky I was Jewish. It was the only thing that kept me alive, because they knew that there were people like you who were watching these Soviets. If anything happened to Lev Elbert, if he died, we would find out about it, and it would have ramifications to US-Soviet relations, trade, and all that stuff. The pressure was working. He said, but those poor Christian prisoners arrested because they were Christians, Pentecostalists, pretty religious people. They were beaten up every day. Some of them died in prison. I saw them beaten up right in front of me, and they had nobody to advocate for them. There was no sense of Christian peoplehood. You know, we've got to stand up for our fellow Christians. It's changing a little today. There are more Christian organizations that are helping beleaguered Christians around the world. But it didn't exist in the Soviet Union. In fact, I'll never forget when I was there, it was right around the trip when Billy Graham went to the Soviet Union. And Billy Graham, if you like him or not, said some really stupid things about the Soviet Union. I remember we were there and we couldn't believe what he was saying. He said, I'm convinced that the Soviet Union is protecting Christian worship here. He fell for all the propaganda, and he completely failed Christians who are getting beaten and destroyed in the Gulag. So it's very interesting. So when you don't have peoplehood, you don't have the magic that we have. We can go to a synagogue. Remember, I was in Seville, Spain. I was looking for a synagogue in all these little streets. They had, they didn't have much of a Jewish life there. And I remember walking, it was so hot there. I finally found this little place where there was a minyan on Friday night, and there was such a welcome from the people there. I said, this is unbelievable. I can be in the middle of nowhere and go to this little synagogue. I don't even speak the language, and yet feel this bond. And I'm so proud of that, because that's really one of the gifts we have of being Jewish and the way that we define themselves. So we have a lot to contribute there. Okay, I think that we're going to call it there. Touched upon the United States and the foundation of our pilgrim heritage and religious values. What I'll do next week, because we don't have time to get into this. Now that we've set the parameters of who a Jew is or should be, and some of the historical conundrums here, what I wanted to finish today is what language do we speak, the role of Hebrew, Yiddish, Ladino, Aramaic, or whatever other languages we have spoken. The role of Hebrew is very interesting. The history of that, the resurrection of Hebrew as a spoken language. And then let me just touch upon, I'll get back to that. That's a whole separate unit, but I want to finish with this are you okay with a little 10 more minutes? Are we okay? So we've defined who we are, and I've already mentioned some of the things and I will mention often what we Jews and Judaism has contributed and will continue to contribute to the rest of the world. A really interesting question. Why should anybody, Jewish or not Jewish, study Judaism? I mean, we're Jewish, so obviously we have an interest in wanting to know our religious roots. But my thesis is that everybody in the world should be studying Jewish history, Jewish values, Judaism. And I have 5 things in my notes, and I have more. We'll do that next week, but just briefly, and we'll cover this a little bit more. Number 1, someone who's anywhere in the world should study Jewish life, Judaism, because Judaism is the mother religion to the 2 largest religious components in the world, Christianity and Islam. You cannot understand those religions without understanding where they came from. And both religions come from within the context of Jewish history. That might sound strange, especially with the Islamic model, but it's historical truth and becoming, as I'm reading now, a much more historical fact that should be dealt with. And this is absolutely astounding. That how many Christians are there in the world? 2.8 billion, and how many Christians are there? I forgot the numbers. Is it 1.8 or 2.8 billion? 1.3 billion Muslims? We're responsible for that. They should know where they came from. And by the way, this has caused the greatest amount of friction between Jews and Christians and Jews and Muslims when this subject is approached. Let's get rid of our Jewish roots as quickly as possible. It's an interesting subject. Number 2, Judaism and Jews revolutionize the most important aspects of civilization. If I were just to throw out some of the things that are Jewish ideas, God, Shabbat, Messiah, linear history, courts and the rule of law, morality is the essence of survival, which we're going to be reading about this Shabbat. The human being is created in the image of God. Nobody came up with that. In other words, the inviolability of all human life. Freedom. Who was it? Heinrich Heine who said, Henry Heine. That was his original name. He was a good Jewish boy who converted and reverted back to Judaism. He said, freedom runs within the blood, really, of the Jewish account, Jewish narrative, the whole notion of freedom. Pesach, the book of Exodus. The concept of diversity in religion. Boy, our people fought for that. The Maccabean revolt, the right to be different throughout Christendom and throughout the Islamic Empire. We'll tell that story. And of course, the primacy that we've placed upon human progress in science, in medicine, dates back, way back in history before anybody even thought about it. The idea of the importance of what people do rather than what people believe is also a revolutionary Jewish concept, and there are more. Those are just some of the things. Without the Jews, none of those things would have ever survived. It is an amazing story. And it took a non-Jew, an Irish what was his name? He wrote the book, The Gift of the Jews. Catlin, I forgot his name. It's an interesting book, by the way. It's still good. And he writes about all these issues. And without the Jews, civilization just simply wouldn't have been the same. Why Jews don't understand? See, for Jews, we should have pride in knowing that we have this legacy that we need to preserve for the world. For non-Jews, they didn't need to know where their own origins come from, especially every American, without knowing the Jewish experience. In the ancient world, the Jews were the only ethnic group to survive the entire biblical period. All the other pagan groups disappear. The Moabites, the Edomites, the Arameans, you name it, they all disappear. All those Hivites, Perizzites, Jebusites, they're all gone. The only group from the ancient world that survived was Israel. Why is that the case? Well, we're going to explore that as well. And of course, in the Roman Empire too, I always tell the story when I saw the rubble of the Roman Empire of the Arch of Titus in Rome. It's quite a scene to look down and see the Roman ruins. And the only monument that's kept intact is the Arch of Titus, which speaks of the defeat of the Jews. So we even survived the Roman Empire. If you were living 2,000 years ago, someone said, in 2,000 years, there would be Jews and no Romans, you would be laughed off the street. No one thought Rome would disappear. Well, it's gone. It's rubble. So it's an interesting story. A great book by Goldman. Wait, what's his name? Oh, History of Judaism. Goodman? Is it Goodman? I forgot his name. Wrote the book called Rome and Jerusalem, one of the best books you could possibly read. The medieval period, the Jews were the only religious group to survive both Christendom and Islam. Why? We'll tell that story. And in the modern period, I think for every human being on earth, the most cataclysmic development in perhaps all of history was the Shoah. Never before had there been a people marked for complete genocide. And if you ever think that that hasn't changed the face of humanity, then you're really living on a different planet. It happened to happen to us. And the world needs to understand why that happened. That's another whole story. We'll get to that as we tell our narrative. And also, along with the Shoah, every human being, and we know that the world's struggling with this one, and that's the creation of the state of Israel. After 2,000 years, there's no other model like this, that a people emerged stateless for 2,000 years and then re-established itself. Believe me, you ask anybody, they think that you even in areas right next to Israel, they say, well, somehow Israelis were plants by the colonialist Americans, and they appeared there and took the land over, and they have no claim to the land. They should completely go back to their homes. There's no attachment between the land of Israel and the Jewish people. They're all plants there. They should all disappear. It's a very popular view. And that's why you have the UK Labour Party declaring that the state of Israel is an illegal apartheid state, wanting it to disappear, because they cannot come to grips with the fact that there are real Jews, people and non-Jews living in that area of the world, which is the size of the province of Wales, surrounded by an area, North America plus a half, and living there. 85% of the UN resolutions are anti-Israel resolutions. Why are they obsessed with us? It's an obsession. And unfortunately, even though we're 0.002% of the world's population, I almost read every day in the newspaper about something going on with our little Jewish state. It's an amazing story. And we're going to try to tell that story in all of its details. So we'll review this a little bit next week. I hope you enjoyed our introduction. And I hope you come along and stay for the adventure. How's everybody doing back there?
Very good.
Okay, let's do that.
Thank you,
If you have
Rabbi.
any questions, let's
Thank you,
do it
Rabbi.
next week. We'll start with questions, and then we'll move on to our next issue. So we'll finish up this one. We'll take about 20 minutes to finish unit number 1, and then we're going to get to a very easy subject, God. So wish me luck on that one, but we'll try to go through all that. So have a great day, and I'll see you tomorrow morning. For those of you who want to continue with the next thing, is that's tomorrow's topic is, where did we start? Why did we start as a people in religion? What are the origins of being Jews? So that's tomorrow. See you guys.